All right, we can get started. So welcome to this DIIS seminar, which will put the spotlight on Taiwan. We'll zoom in on cross-strait relations, the Taiwan conflict, and European approaches to Taiwan against the backdrop of the presidential elections taking place in Taiwan this weekend. And welcome also to those of you watching online. My name is Andreas Forsby. I'm a senior researcher here at the Danish Institute for International Studies, focusing primarily on Chinese foreign and security policy, Nordic-China relations, and also the US-China great power rivalry in the Indo-Pacific region. So I will spend the first 15 minutes introducing today's topic, offering some insights into relations between the Nordic countries and Taiwan. And then I'll leave the floor to today's main speaker, Meia Nouwens, whom I'll introduce later. All right, let's start with, I should use this one, with a brief overview of the presidential elections. And let me rush to add that Saturday's elections included general elections for the Taiwanese parliament as well. But the presidential elections have been at the center of attention for good reasons, given the nature of the Taiwanese political system, with a relatively powerful president, who's chief of the armed forces and appoints the prime minister, and also conducts foreign relations with the outside world. So there's a reason for why we focus primarily on the presidential elections, and it's the presidential palace in Taipei here in the background. So it was a pretty intense presidential election race, with the key topic being Taiwan's relationship with China, that is cross-strait relations. And the three candidates themselves did their utmost to raise the stakes by highlighting the quite different paths they want Taiwan to pursue. While Chinese officials didn't shy away from framing the elections as a choice between war and peace, at least some of the officials did so. So to briefly recapitulate the lineup of presidential candidates. So from the left, we have from the Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, the pro-independence party that has been ruling Taiwan for the past 8 years, incumbent Vice President Lai Ching-te, who is also known as William Lai. And in the middle, from the Kuomintang Nationalist Party, which ruled Taiwan for the first 5 decades before democracy was introduced in Taiwan. We have the KMT candidate, who is current mayor of New Taipei City, Ho Yui. He's in the middle. And finally, the Taiwan People's Party, TPP, a relatively new political party headed by Ko Wen-je. And I'm not sure if I pronounce his name quite correctly, but Meia is nodding. All right. So most opinion polls indicated a pretty tight race, but as you probably all know by now, Taiwan's next president is the man here on the left side, Lai Ching-te. I forgot to introduce the rest of them like this, but here's the guy who won the race. And he won it with around 40% of the votes, and I think it was 8 percentage points down to number 2. But I'll leave it to Meia later to walk us through the implications of the Taiwan presidential election result. Instead, let me use now one slide for talking about why we should pay attention to what's going on in Taiwan in the first place, and then move on to Taiwan-Nordic relations. So why bother, to put it bluntly? After all, we have no shortage of geopolitical challenges in our own European backyard. As you already know from current media coverage, Taiwan is pretty far away from Europe, and we don't even recognize Taiwan as an independent state, right? So why bother? But there are good reasons for paying attention, close attention, and here are some of the most important ones. First of all, Taiwan stands out as a liberal beacon. A flourishing democracy ranked in top 10 in all democracy indexes, Taiwan has come to symbolize a frontline democracy in what some observers view as an ideological struggle between democracies and autocracies. And the Taiwanese DPP government itself has been quite aptly promoting this narrative, presenting itself indeed as a liberal beacon in a region increasingly dominated by an authoritarian China. So were Taiwan's 23 million citizens to be reunified by China, it would deal a serious blow to liberal democracy, notably in Asia. So, Taiwan has also emerged as a high-tech hub. As an indispensable production center in the Western supply chains of the chips industry, Taiwan is fabricating the most advanced microprocessors that play such a crucial role in all modern high-tech products in both the civil and military domain. So were China to take control of, or perhaps just disrupt, these fabrication facilities, it would have a devastating effect on the world economy, far beyond what we witnessed with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That's at least my claim, and others, I should add. Furthermore, Taiwan is a hot spot in a geostrategic sense. Taiwan holds a unique position in the US containment strategy against China, as the island state fills an important gap in the so-called first chain of islands, from Japan in the north over Taiwan in the middle to the Philippines in the south, which enables the US and its network of allies and partners to contain China's rapidly growing naval power projection capacity. Were Beijing conversely to invade and seize Taiwan, it would gain free access to the Pacific Ocean, with significant implications for the broader US-China great power rivalry and struggle in the Indo-Pacific. We'll get back to that later. If we look at Taiwan from a Chinese perspective, the Taiwan issue constitutes the absolute core of China's notorious core interests. The official mantra, often repeated by Xi Jinping himself, states that Taiwan must and will be reunited as part of the PRC's historic mission towards its centennial anniversary in 2049, and maybe much sooner, depending on whom you ask. So long as the Taiwan issue remains unresolved, Beijing will keep up the pressure, including its coercive diplomacy against anyone who challenges its so-called One China principle. And finally, of course, there's the risk of an armed conflict, even if it still seems unlikely that China would invade or install a naval blockade around Taiwan. We certainly cannot rule out those scenarios. And any such conflict would undoubtedly bring in the Americans on Taiwan's side. So, of course, something also to think about. Okay, so that's why we should bother. And there are plenty of other reasons, but at least I've given you some of them. Let's now turn to Nordic countries' relations with Taiwan and start by situating the Nordics within the broader European landscape. So while the US is, of course, Taiwan's most significant international bag and arms supplier, Europe also plays an important role as a partner. Indeed, the EU Parliament has been wielding its normative power in several ways, designating Taiwan as a like-minded strategic partner and sending official delegations to Taiwan in the past few years, one of them standing there in the photo. And EU lawmakers have also unprecedentedly been issuing a couple of Taiwan-only resolutions to demonstrate their support for the Taiwanese and forge stronger bonds to the island state, not least in the wake of Nancy Pelosi's controversial visit to Taiwan in August last year. To be sure, such EP, or European Parliament, EU Parliament resolutions are non-binding, and the EU Commission in Brussels has been far more careful not to rock the boat in its Taiwan-related statements and policy measures. And by rocking the boat, I mean challenging the bedrock of Europe's bilateral relations with China, namely the One China policy. Not to be confused with Beijing's own One China principle. And maybe because it's kind of confusing, we should just spend a minute here specifying which is what. And the One China policy is the diplomatic recognition of the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China. And the One China principle is the claim of the Chinese government that Taiwan is an inalienable part of the People's Republic of China. All right. If we briefly look at how individual European countries relate to Taiwan to provide some comparative context for the Nordic countries. We can observe quite a lot of variation. So on the one side, we have a group of countries, let's refer to them as isolationists, who have turned their backs on Taiwan, even to the extent of accepting Beijing's One China principle. And I put Bulgaria and Greece in that category. We can always discuss that if you're interested. And although we shouldn't place France in that category, President Macron's comments in April last year about not getting caught up in crises that are not ours, referring of course to the Taiwan issue, were widely viewed in Europe as selling out of Taiwan and currying favor with the Chinese. On the other side, we find a group of countries, we can call them expansionists, who have been testing the limits, you can say, of the One China policy by engaging the Taiwanese quite actively in the political realm and also cultivating new areas of cooperation. And both Lithuania and the Czech Republic would fit into that category. And with that, let's transition to the Nordics themselves. So where do the Nordic countries place themselves against this backdrop? And as you can see here, they belong to the opposite side of the spectrum. Some of them are virtually isolationist, and others are more pragmatic in their approach to Taiwan. And I will give you just a few data on this, because I am preparing a report which on Nordic-Taiwan relations, and it will be published in about a month's time from now, I think, in February at some point, where I compare the Nordic countries, how they relate to Taiwan and how they have conducted their bilateral relationships over the past few years. So just to briefly offer you some preliminary findings from the report, just 3 of them. So first, with respect to the official framework for bilateral relations, all 5 Nordic countries have publicly declared their adherence to the One China policy in the past decade in their external relations with the international community. However, the vagueness of this policy, the cautiousness of their public stance, and the growing assertiveness of Beijing have put the Nordic governments on the defensive in the face of Chinese encroachments, as Beijing seeks to impose its own One China principle. For instance, when former Danish Foreign Minister Jeppe Kofod, during a visit to China in late 2021, was quoted by his Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi, as saying that he supports the One China principle, the Danish government refrained from issuing any public correction, thus leaving the Chinese claim undisputed in the Chinese media, including the English language versions of Chinese media, Xinhua and CGTV, to just name a few examples. All right. Second, when it comes to the practical arrangement and conduct of their non-official bilateral relations with Taiwan, the Nordic countries are divided into, on the one hand, a set of isolationist countries, Iceland and Norway, with virtually no direct points of institutionalized bilateral interactions, and thus no substantive interactions with Taiwan. And on the other hand, a group of commercial pragmatists, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden, which, for the sake of promoting their economic interests, operate differently organized trade offices in Taipei, alongside Taiwanese representative offices in their own capitals. Third and finally, so while the Nordic governments have maintained cautiously defensive positions in recent years, the Nordic parliaments, I should press this one, yeah. The Nordic parliaments have been at the forefront of raising and debating Taiwan-related issues and demonstrating support for the Taiwanese, including through visiting MP delegations. But it is a very mixed picture. From the Icelandic Althing, with no Taiwan-related activities at all, and the Finnish Eduskunta, very few activities, to the Norwegian Storting, and the Danish Folketing, with some level of activism, to the Swedish Riksdag, on the other side of the spectrum. Indeed, Swedish MPs from across the aisles have been extremely active in their endeavor to raise awareness about Taiwan's difficult situation and to put pressure on the Swedish government to support the island state more actively. For instance, by urging the Swedish government to take concrete steps to help Taiwan regain its observatory membership of the World Health Assembly, or to prevent the Swedish tax agency from labeling Taiwan a province of China, or to strengthen Sweden's own trade office in Taipei and rename it House of Sweden, as indeed was something proposed by the Swedish parliament, and it was a motion that was adopted not that long ago. So far, the government has not been moving on that at all. It's considering it. That's the official position. But all of these efforts from the Swedish Riksdag have been to no avail so far, I can tell you. I think I'm running out of time here, so if you're interested in learning more about Nordic-Taiwan relations, I will urge you to stay tuned on DIIS.dk for my report. But now let's turn to today's main speaker. Meia, I will invite you up here on the stage. Because we are very delighted to have Meia with us here today. From the DIIS, International Institute for Strategic Studies, where she is a senior fellow for Chinese security and defense policy. Fortunately, Meia is also one of Europe's most knowledgeable and widely used experts on cross-strait relations, which is why we invited you here in the first place. And I know that Meia was also actually raised in Taiwan for some years, and that she spent several years in the European External Action Service as a delegate, you could say, or at least working from Taipei. So you have also experienced the island state firsthand. I should also say that I was actually just going to turn over the word to Meia, but we have just a couple of hours ago agreed to do this as a moderated session instead. So bear over with me if I don't get everything right, and you will just have to extend a bit if I don't get all the questions right. So let's jump into it. And I think the first obvious question, now that we had the elections taking place this weekend, would be to have you guide us through what are the implications. I mean, obviously the DPP won the presidential palace again. It was only by 40%, however. They lost the parliament. So it might not be as clear-cut a victory as it was the previous two times with Taiwan winning the presidential office. But so how do you break it down? What do you primarily look at when you have these results coming in this weekend?
Well, first, Andreas, thank you for having me here, and it's great to be back at DIIS, where these great discussions are always held. A really pertinent and timely topic. I may say you've planned and timed very, very well. Yes, the election results were very interesting. They were also very fast, I have to say. So the elections were held on Saturday of last weekend, on the 13th. The polls closed at 4 p.m. By 6 p.m., we already had an indication that William Lai was going to be a winner. And by 7 p.m., it was pretty much already announced what the results were going to be. So that is a really, really quick counting of ballots, all done manually, all done very transparently, I should say as well, for those who haven't looked at or seen Taiwanese participation in elections before. But you're right to say that although it was a victory, and a historic one in the sense that there's never been one party that has won 3 general elections in a row before, it wasn't as big as a success as perhaps the previous 2 elections had been, where Tsai Ing-wen won with a landslide. I mean, China took this really, I think, in their spokesperson's responses and reflections to the elections, when they said the majority of Taiwanese, as you'll see by the election results, didn't vote for the DPP. So they'll use that in their narrative against William Lai in the future. But you're absolutely right to say that now the DPP, though they have won the election again, they're going to face a tough 4 years in terms of having to negotiate with 2 other major parties in parliament on a whole range of policy issues. So it's really not that straightforward anymore. What I think it also is a reflection of is that in Taiwan in the past, you've had a 2-party system, really, with some other smaller parties that came out of domestic developments, like the Sunflower Movement, a protest movement in Taiwan. But they're no longer really present anymore in parliament. Now you have three major parties who are represented and reflected in parliament, and less room for an extra kind of smaller fringe party representation. However, it does reflect that in Taiwan, the youth in particular have protested in their voting this year. They've said they want more than just the traditional KMT or DPP options. In particular, the youth have complained about the elections really focusing on the same issues all the time, but really not having much options, about the cost of living. So this was also a protest vote to a certain extent to the ruling DPP party for not having delivered on promises enough. And it's also, of course, a protest vote to the KMT, traditional opposition party, for the past 8 years, in the sense that they still haven't come up with a solution that they can sell, or a vision for Taiwan that they can sell to the younger voters. So in all respects, it seems like this is a bit of a new era for the Taiwanese in terms of domestic politics. It's not the first time that this has happened, that there are three parties that participated and one kind of a split vote that happened before in 2000. But I think this time around, Ko In-je's party has the potential to be longer lasting. And it's evident in his kind of speech in which he acknowledged that the TPP had only won 26% of the vote when he said this is just the start. I think this is a party that is going to be looking forward to see how they can build on this 26% victory and how they can win more of the vote in the future. For the KMT, it's a little bit of a different picture. Again, this is they've won this time around a little bit more votes than they did in 2020. But again, they've lost the general election. So they're going to need to do a lot of introspection to see what the future for them holds.
All right, and you already touched upon Beijing's reaction a bit. So, I mean, compared to how they framed it ahead of the elections, talking about a choice between war and peace, and have also labeled Lai Ching-te as a dangerous separatist. So, on that, against that backdrop, it seemed like it was a pretty low-key reaction from Beijing coming out. And I think it was the Taiwan Affairs Office who's just said something along the lines of DPP does not reflect mainstream public opinion in Taiwan these days. And from Beijing, it was also stressed that reunification will eventually, inevitably take place at some point. So I don't know if you have any further comments on how Beijing has reacted so far, or maybe we should be worried that the real reaction will just be further down the road. Or how do you see it?
I mean, what's happened, of course, is that Beijing has responded to the election results. But what happens in May is the inauguration of William Lai as president and Bi Khim-hsiao as vice president. So that leaves about 5 months, really, for things to still happen. Beijing could hold off slightly, as they did leading up to the election. In the past few years, I'm sure you will have noticed in the news an increase in military activity around Taiwan leading up to the election that really dropped off dramatically. And that, I think, was a reflection in Beijing that perhaps pursuing military pressure at a time of elections doesn't get one the results that one wants in a democratic society. So they pulled back on that. So that is likely to increase at some point again to normal levels as over the past year. We've also seen that, yes, the initial reaction from the Taiwan Affairs Office in China was quite, I would say, calm. It wasn't as verbose as some political statements coming out of China have been in the past. I thought what was particularly interesting, in addition to the line about the majority of the Taiwanese not having voted for the DPP, which almost seems a bit of a smug, almost a pointed reflection. The other thing that I noted was that the rest of the statement was really pointed towards the Taiwanese people to say, well, we will continue to work with the Taiwanese people on people-to-people relations and through trade. And there has been a growing, I think, tone in Chinese official statements towards Taiwan of that addressing the wider population, not just leadership comments. That, I think, is an attempt to, again, circumvent politics and hopefully win hearts and minds. That's, I think, difficult, but Beijing has been trying to do that nonetheless. There has been a stronger statement, of course, and that came after some others made congratulatory remarks towards Taiwan, namely Wang Yi in Egypt made some harsher comments about the United States' congratulatory statements, and again warning Taiwan of the potential risks in the future.
Yeah, and about the congratulatory statements, if we sort of move to our own region, Europe, there have been a few statements also from Europe. There was one from Germany, one from France, one from the EU, and also from the UK. And I noted that those messages were, congratulating the Taiwanese democratic system for a successfully held elections, rather than a congratulation notice for William Lai himself, himself. So there's a difference there. But what else do you make of the reaction so far from Europe?
So I think the first reflection is only the minority of Europeans have congratulated Taiwan on their successful democratic, free and fair elections, exactly, which is a point in and of itself and kind of reflective of the status of how Europe looks at Taiwan and where kind of the hesitance still lies in how open and forward-leaning to be in Europe-Taiwan relations. So the fact that only the UK, France, Germany, and the EU made statements at all, I think is quite striking. Second of all, you're absolutely right to say that France, Germany, and the European Union did not mention the name of William Lai at all. They only spoke, as you said, in general terms towards Taiwan. In some ways, that's reflective of the point that I just made before. But on the other hand, for a country like France, it's actually an improvement because 4 years ago, the French official statement congratulated Taiwan, or just noted that there was an election, a local election that was held in Taiwan. So it didn't even go as far as to congratulate on presidential or general elections. So this is a step forward for France, I would say, towards being more forward-leaning to supporting Taiwan. The UK is, I think, here an exception, in the sense that the UK did name Lai Ching-te by name and did congratulate in quite a lengthy statement the Taiwanese on their elections.
Okay. Yeah, and staying with the Europe-Taiwan relations, I mean, we've noticed some change the past 5 years. I think that's probably an understatement, but I guess you can talk about that. And I mean, it's also, if we look at Europe's relations with China, they have also changed quite a lot the past 5 years, at least since 2018. I was just, with the Hong Kong crisis and the Xinjiang genocide accusations and all that, and other topics that have been very sensitive between Europe and China. And I was just wondering if you would say that it sort of mirrors our relations with Taiwan. So if our relationship with China is deteriorating, our relationship with Taiwan is improving. Or is that sort of too reductionist to put it like that? Or is it actually that dynamic that has been, spurring some sort of improvements in how we have approached Taiwan in the past 5 years?
So I think, look, it's a touchy question, but if I'm going to be frank, then I'll say that Taiwan has been a democracy for a lot longer than just the last 5 years. So something has changed to make Europeans more interested in Taiwan. And from my perspective, if you kind of look at the trend lines and the developments that have happened over the last 5 years, and in particular in the last 3 or 4 years from COVID, it would seem that Chinese actions have caused a reevaluation in Europe about the relationship that Europe has had with Taiwan, the European relationship with Taiwan currently, and where room to grow or to develop that relationship might be in the future. That is namely what happened around COVID, and in particular wolf warrior diplomacy conducted by the PRC across Europe, quite forcefully in rhetorical terms over the last few years. It's the crackdown on protests that we've seen in Hong Kong. It's the human rights abuses that Europe has been quite critical of with regards to Xinjiang. And there's, of course, now a question of China's not just activity in the Indo-Pacific, but indirect support of an actor like Russia that has a direct implication for European security in and of itself. So I think there has been just a growing recognition of the changing geopolitical trends over the last few years, not just normative ones, but ones that actually impact European security, whether that's economic security or hard security moving forward, interests in Europe and interests in the Indo-Pacific, and an understanding that European and Indo-Pacific security are linked to each other and cannot be seen as separate. So that, I think, has created the basis to be more forward-leaning by certain countries in towards Taiwan and in their Taiwan relations. Now, interestingly, European countries have been developing Indo-Pacific policies. They've also, certain European countries and the EU have been developing Indo-Pacific policies. Some European countries have even developed and published new China policies, but no European countries are developing Taiwan policies. So from my perspective, Taiwan relations are still guided by a one China policy, not a one China principle. We have to remember that in Europe and in European capitals. And they are still very much in minds linked to decisions across a Taiwan Strait dynamic.
Yeah, okay. So you have observed now that Europe as a whole, and some countries in particular, that those I called expansionists in my own presentation, have been more forward-leaning when it comes to developing ties with Taiwan in some respects. But I guess, I mean, all of this still takes place within the framework of the one China policy, as you just mentioned. And I was just curious about, I guess there are still some very significant limitations to how far they can develop their relations with Taiwan. And maybe you could speak a bit about those as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that the picture isn't all positive when it comes to the developments of EU, Taiwan, and Europe-Taiwan relations. Certainly the trend lines are more positive than they have been in the past, where European capitals are now more interested in examining how one can diversify trade more with Taiwan as opposed to with China, with the PRC, where countries now value Taiwan's particular strengths in the high-tech sectors, and where they see Taiwan as a like-minded partner. But you're right to say that there are restrictions here. I think capitals, certain capitals have been on the receiving end of quite harsh retaliation and responses by the PRC at times for their choices with regards to actions towards Taiwan or towards China. So the threat of coercion or the actual coercion of European capitals is still a problem, and one that is at the mind of capitals when they make decisions about Taiwan. So whether or not to congratulate Taiwan or for their successful elections, or, for example, how far to go with sending delegations to Taiwan, at what level, so on and so forth. There's, of course, I think also a question about lack of expertise in Europe on Taiwan and on China. A number of governments in Europe are starting to promote more and direct more resources to building in-house, within government and across government China expertise. But I think very few have actual Taiwan expertise in of its own right. So that, I think, is a bit of a hindrance as well to understanding where the limits really lie and being able to creatively maybe look a little bit beyond that. And lastly, there's limits of cooperation, I think, very firmly for most European countries lie in the realm of defense and security cooperation, which is still quite touchy. In the past, European cooperation with Taiwan has been very much on human rights, very much on trade and on culture. These days, that's expanding towards, as I said, high-tech and circular economy and things like that. But on the other hand, Taiwan does have a need and does have a wish to diversify its defense and security engagements and cooperation away from just having the United States as its main security guarantor. And here, Europeans, I think, are a little bit more hesitant to play a role. It doesn't mean that they don't. There are European countries that do, but by and large, I think that is still a sensitive topic.
Yeah, that's a nice segue to talk about the military situation, I guess. It's I mean, with the election of William Lai and the DPP, we know that tensions will remain rather high going forward. And I mean, even if it's unrealistic, I guess both from your and my perspective, that we would see an outright Chinese military invasion of Taiwan, and probably also quite unrealistic that they would take a step such as installing a naval blockade, because that also constitutes an act of war according to international law. But I guess that there are other solutions or other instruments that China could use, and at the same time we cannot completely rule out those scenarios, because the Chinese government has, of course, openly pronounced that at some point they will need to move on this issue, and we cannot leave the issue for future generations to be solved and all that. So it's not to rule out those military scenarios. And just to stay on that theme, I was wondering, could Europe even, you touched upon it a bit in your previous answer, but could Europe play a role in sort of assisting or helping Taiwan in its build-up of military capabilities in any meaningful way?
So thank you for setting me up for that question, because I wrote a paper on that with a couple of colleagues at the end of 2021, early 2022, in which our answer was yes, there are certain capabilities that Europe had in the past a surplus in that could have been potentially thought of as useful in any eventual or potential Taiwan contingency in the future. However, then Ukraine happened, and the war in Ukraine has of course taken up a lot of Europe's not only attention, but also of course resources and military equipment. So that picture looks a little bit more complicated than it did in the past. Nevertheless, I think there is still the possibility of areas where Europe can play a role in helping Taiwan to build up its deterrence capability. Think, for example, in non-kinetic areas like cyber, or in the trade in dual-use components that are defense relevant, but not necessarily big platforms like fighter jets or naval warships. I think those are unlikely areas of cooperation, but defense industry to defense industry cooperation could be a potential way forward. Some countries are already doing that. Some European countries are currently already have helped, I should say, since the sub has already been revealed. Taiwan build a domestic indigenous attack submarine capability. And similarly, countries like the Czech Republic have also agreed to work with Taiwan on defense industrial cooperation. So there are areas in which Europe can play a role. However, I would say that even if that's limited, it is incredibly necessary for Europe to at least start thinking about these issues moving forward. I completely agree with you that in outright conflict across the Taiwan Strait, outright kinetic conflict across the Taiwan Strait in the near future is unlikely. However, I would note that it is better to prepare for these things rather than be surprised by them and respond within short notice. Furthermore, if you just look at European defense industry at the moment, it's already still struggling to keep up with the demand to support and supply Ukraine in its efforts to defend itself. So add Taiwan into that mix in the future. If that happens, Europe will be stretched. So planning needs to happen sooner rather than later.
All right, let's also just towards the end here of this moderated part, zoom out a bit and take a look at the US-China relations. So we all have noticed this diplomatic thaw between US and China, and some even speculated that it might have contributed to China's rather mild reaction to the election of DPP and Lai Ching-te. But I was wondering if the election itself plays any role in how the US-China great power rivalry will be playing out in the next few years, at least next 4 years within the Indo-Pacific region. If it changes anything, I mean, there are those people who think of Taiwan as a pawn in this great power rivalry game. It also has its own actorship, of course. But I mean, how do you see this? Does it change anything? Because again, some people also see the U.S.-China diplomatic thaw as a tactical movement. That the strategic bottom line is unchanged. That the U.S. is still preparing for its encirclement of China behind the scenes, and that China is also taking its own precautionary measures. But how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I think it's really important that you noted that Taiwan has agency, and that's the first thing to keep in mind, of course. But I think it is undeniable that Taiwan will play a significant role within is already playing a significant kind of role within U.S.-China relations and how those develop, with China very convinced at this point that the United States is using Taiwan as a pawn to contain it and to provoke it. And the United States convinced that China has been and is changing the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. As you noted in your presentation, which was excellent, the statement that Taiwan plays a role in the containment of China, I would say that is very much China's perception that the U.S. is on a path of containment, and that path of containment is only going to be more and more reinforced moving forward. So the trend lines are not positive in that respect. However, you are also right to note that in recent months, certainly in the last half year, the U.S. and China have been taking efforts to make tactical pauses and tactical adjustments to thaw this relationship a little slightly, to at least build some kind of floor under the relationship so that it doesn't spiral completely out of control. And around Taiwan, there have been efforts as well, I think, to hold back to a certain extent, and that's on the Chinese side as well as the United States side. So just as an example, after then Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan, you will all have seen that the PRC held military exercises around Taiwan. There's a question as to why they showcased certain capabilities as opposed to others. My argument is that they would only showcase capabilities that are confident for them to use, that they're comfortable in showcasing, that don't have a high failure rate. But in particular, also capabilities that don't potentially send the signal to the United States that that an armed attack was underway. So, for example, was there a large-scale amphibious exercise? Not really, there was not. So I think that's an element in this. Similarly, for the United States, there wasn't a second speaker visit. Instead, Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen still visited the new Speaker of the House, McCarthy, in the U.S. during her transit, and now the next U.S. delegation visiting Taiwan is retired former top officials who are visiting. So I think there are efforts on both sides to not give in to not take decisions or make moves that could be misinterpreted easily, or that could cause miscalculation and misunderstanding.
Okay, that's good to know. So let's move. It's perfect timing. We now have around 45 minutes for the Q&A session, and I hope that you have some questions. And there will be a microphone going around, and please state your name and background before asking a question. And yeah, that's about it. So I think there's one down there.
Thank you. My name is Jenny Histermann. I'm a historian of German history and completely new to the topic, so thank you both. I wanted to ask a little bit clarifying about the sensitive topic that you spoke about. I mean, it seems to be very clear to you that the European countries are so hesitant in congratulating, except for the big three. So is it, I understood it's not to anger China because the economy with China is so important for Europe. Is that, like, this is my question, is that correct? Is this why they're so hesitant on saying we congratulate Taiwan for its like vibrant democracy? And the other thing is connected about the military help. I mean, the European countries were very hesitant in sending weapons to Ukraine, notably Germany. And the argument, why bother, that you like developed in the beginning, why would Europeans even bother to care about Taiwan if they cared so little about the Ukraine? And I mean, this is at our doorstep. Why would we defend a democracy far away in the Pacific Ocean, right? I mean, this doesn't seem so evident to me, self-evident that, as you said, Europe can help Taiwan, but how do you like estimate that this is realistic in the hopefully unlikely event of invasion?
Thank you. And I think we'll just start with one question, right? And instead of collecting questions, also I don't see any fingers raised.
Well, I can give a lengthy answer to this. Two excellent questions. Look, I think when it comes to making statements about Taiwan, and this is not just about congratulating Taiwan for its democratic election, it goes to any statement about Taiwan. These are statements that are poured over and thought about really into detail by European capitals, and have been certainly in the past. So the words that are used or not used are indicative of policy positions. Also, if one has not issued a statement before and then the next time does issue a statement, that's departure from precedent. And it's setting a precedent. So I think certain countries are hesitant to give an indication that their policies have dramatically changed, perhaps. There is an element here of being concerned about what the impact of that might be in terms of retaliation from the PRC. I think that is an element of it. But on the other hand, I think the bigger point is not wanting to give the indication that larger policies have changed, that countries still adhere to, for example, the one China policy. On your second question, just on that last bit, Germany actually for the first time, I think, responded with the statement. So that is a departure and should be read with some interest. Secondly, on your second question, why should Europe care? I think you need to do your presentation again. But I think, look, Taiwan is far away, and you're absolutely right to say that European governments have to make the case better as to why they would care, why they should care. 40% of the world's trade, or 60% of the world's trade travels through the Indo-Pacific region. And a conflict in the Indo-Pacific would be in nobody's interest. Semi-conductors, Taiwan has a monopoly on those still in the most advanced semiconductor fields. Any war across the Taiwan Strait that would involve the United States and Japan and China and Taiwan and others would very quickly lead to severe economic disruption and cost, not just for the American economy or the Taiwanese economy or the Chinese economy. We're talking 3 trillion minimum of the global economy gone. And that's just on a 1-year blockade, according to statistics that were drawn up last year by an excellent institute called Rhodium Group. That's not even thinking about what a war would cost the global economy. So it is in everybody's interest to ensure that stability and the status quo are maintained across the Taiwan Strait when it comes to our own interests. Furthermore, on top of that, it's very important that Europe participates in these debates, at least, because if it doesn't, if we're just leaving it to the United States and China to talk about Taiwan, it very much gives the impression that this is just something between the two of those countries, when actually it is something of global importance. So internationalizing this debate means that the PRC can no longer just say this is just the United States provoking us. That's also very important for the rest of the Indo-Pacific, who have no interest in the US and China going to war with each other, but hedge their bets, of course, in their relationships between the US and China. And so bringing Europe into this discussion, having Europe be part of this debate, is incredibly important for them as well, to show that there are more countries that care about this and more voices to help balance and hopefully calm down any tensions if they do rise further. Is it realistic that European militaries will ever play a leading role in a Taiwan contingency if war does break out? No, that's not what I'm trying to say. What I think is likely is that the Americans will have specific asks for certain European countries to support them. And we have to think about that in a number of ways. It can be about supporting US forces in the Indo-Pacific by providing additional equipment or platforms or capabilities. It could be about helping Taiwan with intelligence or surveillance, but it could also be about helping the United States by taking over responsibilities in areas closer to home. So if the US has to move its forces from the Gulf, for example, or the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific, if war breaks out across the Taiwan Strait, then Europeans could potentially play a role in filling that gap in the Middle East for the United States. Similarly, Europe just being more concerned about Europe and building up our own security and defense capabilities for European security also helps the United States free up capacity to help to pay more attention to the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, we have another question down there.
Hi, my name is Teresa. I'm just interested in this topic. I don't have any professional background. But I'm interested in hearing more about the expansionist category that you mentioned, Czech Republic and Lithuania. What exactly did that mean in terms of expanding their engagement with Taiwan? And what have been the repercussions in terms of a Chinese response? And can they even, given that they're part of the EU, is there any response that the Chinese can make that doesn't affect the EU, that only affects these two countries?
Okay. I think that goes to me, that question.
That goes to you.
Okay, so it's true that I mentioned a few expansionist countries up there, and if we just stick to those two, the Czech Republic and Lithuania, I think Lithuania is probably the most well-known example because they made a minor change a couple of years ago in how they allowed the Taiwanese representative office in Lithuania, in Vilnius, to label itself as a Taiwanese representative office of Taiwan instead of Taipei. And that small adjustment provoked a huge response from Beijing, which actually recalled its ambassador from Vilnius and also made it clear to the Lithuanians that they were not welcome in Beijing no longer. And how did that affect the rest of the EU? So actually, Chinese, apart from using economic coercion against Lithuania, which wasn't, by the way, very effective because Lithuania only has around 1% of its total exports going to China in the first place. But they also started targeting third parties, you could say. So those companies that are involved in the supply chains and at some point going through Lithuania. So there was this, I think, example with a German car tire producer who was coming under a lot of pressure from Beijing that it should cease its supply chains with Lithuania. But then the EU stepped in and they recently adopted their anti-coercion measures, a new directive, exactly to deter China from picking on any of its individual member states. So that was kind of a long story to tell you that some European countries have maybe expanded a bit experimented a bit in terms of, being more, cultivating closer ties with Taiwan, and they have experienced this coercive diplomacy from China, and now the EU is sort of helping them, assisting them in dealing with the repercussions of how China has responded. But I wouldn't say it's advisable to be among those who are in the front line. And within the European community, there's no doubt that there were many other partners of Lithuania who were kind of shocked about their forward-leanedness and the repercussions that had some effect on all European countries. So it's not a popular approach to adopt among the Europeans, to be more forward-leaning. And I think they are quite disciplined these days. I don't know, Meia, if you want to supplement here, provide some different perspectives, but and there's one additional thing to notice, and it is that it's mostly the European parliaments who are in the front line. So they are sending the delegations to visit Taiwan. So the Czech Republic that I also mentioned, I mean, they have been sending some very large delegations. I think the last one was including 150 members, including the chairman of the Defense Committee and the Foreign Policy Committee in the not in the Senate, but in the lower house of the Czech Republic. So they have taken some rather significant steps, but it's mostly the parliaments that are, doing the legwork here, not so much the governments, even though the new incoming Czech president did receive a congratulatory call from Taiwan, which was also unprecedented.
But maybe I can just add one thing to your answer on top of that, which is when thinking about how Beijing responds to European countries or others changing perhaps or developing further their the actions and the cooperation engagement they're willing to take with Taiwan, I think it's really interesting to note the different responses to different countries. So Beijing doesn't respond to every country in the same way. And as Andreas noted, for Lithuania, it was incredibly ineffective how they responded to Lithuania, because the whole point was that Lithuania moved away from its participation in a regional blocking called, at that point, I think, was it 17 or 16+1, because it had promised at the start of it greater engagement or for leader-to-leader talks, meeting face-to-face or on the phone, greater investment by China into the country, and none of that had really eventuated. So there was not really much for Lithuania to lose. And when you're in that position, PRC tactics to coerce or punish don't really have a huge impact. So what, as Andreas said, what the PRC did next was to move further and target those that would perhaps be swayed in their action. And we see that with regards to different responses as well, whereby countries like Germany and the UK can take very similar policy decisions with regards to Taiwan. Countries in continental Europe, like Germany, have faced harsher responses from the PRC as opposed to the UK. And I think what that speaks to is a very calculated approach by Beijing as to how to punish and whom to punish. A calculation in that has to be the country that is being targeted, and the importance that that country specifically plays from Beijing's perspective in terms of its foreign policy. So the UK having a very different position from Beijing's perspective as an important country than, for example, how other countries in Europe might be perceived.
Great. We have another question down there. Bertel Hørlin.
Sure. I'm Bertel Hørlin, University of Copenhagen. I would like to put a question about the future of the concept of ambiguity, because, well, it is, in fact, the core of the problem at all. And we have seen and always seen a lot of discussions about ambiguity and look at the United States, of course. United States has this privilege of being a superpower, and this way it's able even to use the ambiguity policy in a much greater way, because, well, they also concerning, of course, United States political system. You have a president. The president can say one thing, but you also have the president's office could say another thing, and even you see then you have the Pelosi problem and all other questions is involved here. But I would like to ask this question because as it looks now, I mean, we have a certain I would even call it a kind of detente, as we have been discussing between China and the United States. But still, you have this ambiguity, and that suddenly also in this context, you can see after the San Francisco meeting, you heard what the American president said about Xi Jinping and so on and so forth, and even Raimondo referred to, well, a couple of days after the discussion in San Francisco, he said, "We are not friends with China. We are not. We are certainly not on the same side of China." So. The ambiguity policy seems also to be a problem for Taiwan, for instance. I mean, Taiwan, could you imagine Taiwan ever having a kind of a national security policy? Well, it's immaterial in my way. How would they at all give a kind of wording for this kind of policy? And even China, maybe you also could say, has a certain kind of ambiguity policy because, well, of course, China's policy is the most. Well, they said it's a rock policy. It's a basic policy. You cannot change it. But the time frame could be kind of an ambiguity because, well, time. When? What does it mean? Should it be now, or should it be as long as Xi Jinping is in power, or something like it? But the main question is, how do you see the policy of ambiguity is evolving now?
You've laid out a lot of excellent points. I think you're right to say that it's not just the United States who has a policy of ambiguity. I think that's quite important to note. And despite President Biden's statements, which I think were purposeful, I don't think that they were mistakes, the US still officially adheres to its policy of ambiguity. So it does still value it. And I know that there are ongoing debates about whether or not ambiguity should change into a policy of a clear policy statement. But I think the moment one starts to draw red lines, it becomes quite dangerous. So drawing those red lines, I think, can invite those red lines being crossed. China, similarly, as you noted, has a policy of ambiguity. It's got 6 conditions for which it might consider military action towards Taiwan to be lawful or necessary, but even those can be interpreted quite vaguely as well. So at the moment, ambiguity still, from my perspective, seems to serve its purpose. For Taiwan and how it's responding to this, at least in defense terms, that is reflected in a procurement policy and strategy of developing not just asymmetrical capabilities, but of course also conventional platforms like the submarine or warships moving forward, and domestic indigenous fighter aircraft or trainer aircraft rather. So in that sense, Taiwan militarily is planning for both as well in hedging.
All right, I think we have another question from Jakob down there.
Hi there. My name is Jacob. I'm a colleague of Andreas here at DIIS. Thanks a lot for the presentations here. I have 2 questions. I'll make them very brief. One is for the Taiwanese conception or perception of TSMC. Right, so democracy chips, right, or liberal chips, or whatever we're calling them, right? So by far, as you mentioned as well, they make the best chips in the world, right? It's 3 nanometers, maybe 2 very soon, and nobody in the world can compete with TSMC, right? But what if TSMC sets up shop in Japan, in the US, in Germany, just mentioning random examples? Is Taiwan still geopolitically interesting then, right? So what's the future of TSMC, right? Because that is the #1 reason, aside from freedom of navigation, right, that we're interested in Taiwan. That's question number 1. Question number 2.
Shield.
Sorry, what's that?
The Silicon Shield.
The Silicon Shield, that's another name. Thanks a lot, Andreas. The second question is a slightly larger question, and is how scary is China? Right? Why am I asking? I'm asking, actually Bloomberg had an assessment of the price of a Taiwan war just the other day, and it was $10 trillion, right?
Yeah.
So that's 10% of global GDP, right? So that's more than the Rhodium Group, right, that you mentioned. But economically, the first article I read after the Taiwan election was that they didn't lower the interest rate anyways in China, right? And why is that interesting? Because they're trying to save a struggling economy. We've had the Evergrandes and the country gardens and the LGFV debt, etc., etc. There's a lot of issues to struggle with on the Chinese economy. So economically, they're challenged, right, to say the least, right? Politically, they're also becoming increasingly isolated in the world. There's a lot of pushback against their wolf warrior diplomacy. But my real question is militarily. How scary is China militarily? Another Bloomberg article, I'm sure you read it just the other day, kind of gave a few examples of widespread corruption in the PLA. And there's been a lot of people being fired, including Li Shangfu, the Ministry of Defense, in the year that passed. Some generals from the PLA rocket forces. In the New Year's, 9 additional members were fired. Maybe he's really worried that the PLA is kind of deeply corrupt and not up to the task, like Russia's military wasn't up to the task. So the question is, how scary is China? Question mark.
Yeah.
Good questions for you.
Excellent questions for me, because I've been looking at PLA modernization for the past 6 longer years. I won't say how many years, but on your first question of Silicon Shield, democracy chips, look, I think there's a point here whereby I dislike the term Silicon Shield because I think if it gives the impression that Taiwan is protected from a potential attack by the PRC because of its highly valuable semiconductor industry. What I think is a much more interesting and perhaps more realistic argument is to say that, as you rightly did, semiconductor industry has made Taiwan highly relevant and interesting for the West in a way that it wasn't before. As I said previously, Taiwan has been a democracy for quite some time now. Even if it's a young democracy, it's still been one for longer than we've had this peak in interest for it. So COVID and supply chain security and economic security discussions definitely heightened our interest in Taiwan and the importance of Taiwan in our prioritization list for foreign policy. You're right to say that for now, no one can compete with Taiwan in advanced semiconductor chip manufacturing, and that's because they have an entire ecosystem built around it, not just because they're the leader, the market leader in the world for now. And I say for now because you're right that friendshoring might provide greater fab and manufacturing capabilities outside of Taiwan. We have to keep in mind that that's offshore production. That's not an entire ecosystem yet. And building an entire ecosystem in the United States, in Japan, and in Germany will take a long, long time to match up to what TSMC has. It's not just about having a factory. It's about having the talent. It's about having the university systems that underpin it. It's about having the resources and supply chains that support it. It's about having the design companies and so on and so forth. So it's a step, but it's a long way for us to be able to compete with TSMC just yet. The other point here, and something that we were talking about during our discussion over lunch about the silicon shield, was how far TSMC is going to be able to continue to innovate in its current kind of product capacity, because it is moving towards a 2 nanometer. But there is a question by experts, and I am no technical expert here, that moving beyond 2 nanometer might be very, very difficult. So at some point, that starts to be a question as well. And that's something to think about. And certainly something that is very relevant and very pertinent for Taiwan leaders and decision makers at the moment. There was, I think in the Commonwealth magazine at the end of last year, a public survey of Taiwanese businesses and international businesses in Taiwan asking what their main concern was for 2024. And over 60% of them said a potential conflict across the Taiwan Strait in the next 5 years. So companies, the private sector, even though we're interested in Taiwan, is concerned about investment risk in Taiwan. And that's the opposite of what Taiwan wants right now, since it wants to diversify its trade relationships away from just depending on China. So this is a complex and kind of a moving picture, but one that we have to be mindful of in Europe as well, of course. When we talk about de-risking from China, that creates great, fantastic new synergies like offshoring and friendshoring, but at the same time might also, in the minds of the private sector, create an equal risk for investing in Taiwan. On your second question of how scary is the PLA, you are absolutely right to say that corruption is a problem in the PLA. We have all read the news about that, and that is a longer story that has been ongoing than just when it has been reported in the news. And it also goes beyond the PLA rocket force. But the fact that it is predominantly within the rocket force and presumably linked now, thanks to reports from the US intelligence community, confirming that it has to do with procurement corruption around key intercontinental ballistic missile capabilities, is, I think, probably a dampening effect on any potential adventurism or confidence that the PLA might have in its own capabilities and that China's leadership has in the PLA's capabilities. We have to remember that missiles are being developed and modernized and diversified within the PLA's arsenal for a reason, and that reason is deterrence, and that reason is to keep the United States and others at bay and at risk in the event of a Taiwan contingency, to deter them from intervening. If those don't work, that's a problem. Furthermore, if loyalty is a problem within the PLA, that's a huge issue for President Xi Jinping. We have to remember that the People's Liberation Army is the Communist Party's armed wing. It's not a national military. It's a military that is loyal to the party and is loyal to Xi Jinping himself as the head of that. So for this to happen now, 10 years after the first round of anti-corruption purges across the military and the defense industry, I think is a little bit of a blow to Xi Jinping's efforts to rule out corruption and to make the PLA truly a combat-oriented warfighting machine that runs on merit as opposed to graft. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, this is a huge military. They have massive amounts of capability, or they're building extensive capability across all domains. So this is a setback, but we still need to be concerned about their capabilities moving forward.
All right. Do we have any other questions? If not, then I might ask one myself towards the end. Let it be the final question, and we have 50 minutes, but we could also stop a bit ahead of time. So I was just curious about if we can't completely rule out a military invasion, but it's very unlikely, and the naval blockade is perhaps not either the most likely instrument that China will put to use. But I mean, China has other instruments to at its disposal. And one instrument that was sort of brought out there in the open last year, if it wasn't clearly put to any use yet, was when, and I think you mentioned it briefly during one of your answers, when Tsai Ing-wen traveled to the US to have a meeting with the Speaker, Kevin McCarthy. And the Chinese, of course, they reacted quite furiously. They hosted some military exercises involving, also elements that could, be interpreted as preparing for an invasion from the other side of the Taiwan. But at least leaving that aside, there was another message that didn't draw as many headlines, and that was the message from the Fujian province. It was the local authorities, I guess, that put out the message. But they said something along the lines of, we will impose an inspection regime in the Taiwan Strait, and on both sides of the median line, we will inspect vessels. And they didn't clearly state for what purposes. But at least given that we know also that China itself doesn't really consider the Taiwan Strait to be international waters, they have labeled it internal, or at least they have jurisdiction over these waters, sovereignty over the Taiwan Strait. So in their mind, it would be in their right to inspect vessels in the Taiwan Strait for various purposes, not just to find out whether they carry weapons, you could say. So I'm just curious if you think that this particular scenario of imposing an inspection regime in the Taiwan Strait would be one of those instruments that they could bring to bear going forward with the DPP still in office. They have labeled William Lai as a dangerous separatist, and I guess tensions will still be there and all that. So.
Yeah, no, I think you're entirely correct here. We normally, when we talk about kind of scenarios of how this could play out, how the PRC could increase pressure on Taiwan, or in the event, kind of in a step-ladder way, lead to a conflict in Taiwan, we almost see four options as completely separate. That's how they're normally presented. I would disagree that they are separate. There's the gray zone, below the threshold of conflict responses, think cyber coercion, disinformation, so on and so forth. Then there's the idea of a blockade, whereby Taiwan is blockaded by PLA warships, or the Chinese Coast Guard, or the maritime militia, or a combination of those. Then there's a joint fire strike that could be targeted against the island. And lastly, an invasion. And I think the idea of a blockade is sometimes presented as a low-hanging fruit, as something that isn't kinetic or doesn't have to be kinetic, so it could be something quick and easy for the PRC to employ to achieve its goals of forced reunification. I disagree with that because, one, a blockade is not quick, and it certainly isn't uncomplicated. It is an act of war, so it would potentially result in responses. A blockade also invites somebody to break your blockade, and if somebody breaks your blockade, well, then escalation is kind of in your court. So you have to decide whether or not to escalate, and if you escalate, then you could potentially end up in a conflict. So, in my mind, a blockade and a full-scale conflict are not two separate things. And for the PLA to be ready to or willing to enact a blockade, there has to be a willingness and a readiness in the back of the mind to be able to enter confidently into full-scale conflict over Taiwan. So from my perspective, that's not highly likely or easy or an easy fix. A quarantine, as you mentioned, is much more than an act of legal warfare or lawfare, as it's sometimes termed. And here I think there have been steps, as you mentioned, by the PRC to change kind of legal perceptions and definitions around the waters around Taiwan, furthermore about the Coast Guard's jurisdiction as well through the Coast Guard law that was amended 2 years ago. So they're taking steps that could result in that, but again, the legal implications and the practical implications of that, I think, are something that probably still need more working through within China, things that we haven't necessarily seen fully explained or written about in the public domain. Nevertheless, not impossible. And here, adding to kind of the psychological part of warfare, and that's really what this would be an impact on in Taiwan, is the taking away of sovereignty really at the end of the day through a legal shipping quarantine, trading quarantine. is equally also the poaching of diplomatic allies. And I bring that to the fore because just today we heard news that Nauru is once again changing its allegiance between diplomatic recognition of Taiwan and China, so moving from Taiwan to diplomatically recognizing China. And Taiwan is now left with only 2 handfuls of diplomatic allies. That is important because the moment that Taiwan has 0, I think is a moment that will be quite devastating psychologically for the Taiwanese population, and a reason for why the PRC is pursuing that line of effort. One last thing that I want to note, and that goes back to the previous question by the gentleman in the back, is linked to this, and it's that psychological warfare effort. And I think if I understood you correctly, you said China is more and more politically isolated. Did I get that? So I don't think that's the case. I think in Europe and in the West, we're increasingly critical of the PRC and some of the policy actions that they've taken, but we forget that the rest of the world doesn't think like we do necessarily. And so China is putting a huge amount of effort into influencing narratives, influencing policy decisions, and influencing kind of groupings around the world to align with its own interests, and that includes on Taiwan. So narrative battles around Taiwan are incredibly important, not just in Europe, but also in the global south, for example. And I just wanted to add that as a last note.
Noted. I think we managed to cover a lot of ground today, not just the Taiwanese elections. So thank you so much, Meia. It was a great privilege to have you here. And thank you also to all of you for coming today, and stay tuned for more seminars or my upcoming report. Thank you so much.
Andreas.